Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. You're going to listen to an interview with Tony Lovell, co-founder and CEO of SLM Partners. We discussed quite a bit in this interview, ranging from the biology of regenerative agriculture to what's probably the biggest hidden cost in livestock operations, stress on animals. And we also discuss where does regenerative agriculture fit in your investment portfolio and where should smart investors, smart impact investors look at when they want to get involved? What are the conditions they need to think of before they get involved in the regenerative agriculture space? Welcome to another episode of Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, investing as if the planet mattered. Podcast show where I talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land, grow our food and what we eat. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. Before we get started, I've been recording these interviews next to my day job, and I will definitely continue to do so and release about an episode a month. But at the same time, I would love to take this further, share more interviews. There are many more stories to share on investing in regenerative food and agriculture. More depth, improve the quality, maybe even doing some video series. So I started a Patreon community, which makes it easy to support creators like myself. If these podcasts have been of value to you, and if you have the means, I invite you to support me and make this happen. For more information, please find the link to my Patreon account in the description below. And now, without further ado, the interview. Enjoy! So welcome to this podcast. I'm Koen van Seijen, the host of today. Today in the podcast we have Tony Lovell, co-founder and CEO of SLM Partners, an asset manager that acquires and manages rural land on behalf of institutional investors to scale up regenerative and ecological farming and forestry systems. Welcome, Tony.
Welcome. Thank you very much.
So to start right into the interesting part, why are you in this sector? Why are you doing this after a successful career in the corporate world?
There is probably nothing I would rather be doing with my life at the moment than this. I find it intellectually, emotionally, physically just challenging and rewarding on a whole range of levels. The opportunity to combine the ecological, the social and the financial in a good balance, to do it at scale, to activate institutional capital in genuinely regenerative and sustainable agriculture, it's a nice place to be.
Yeah, and I think also we're living in nice times to do that. But you started a number of years ago. Can you walk me through the steps you took and the steps in your mind you took to end up at livestock in Australia, what you're working on now, and not, for instance, solar in South Africa?
Okay. So a bit of background. There's been farming and agriculture in my family for several generations. My great-grandparents were some of the early settlers in one of the areas in Queensland here in Australia. And my father had grown up on a farm. We had some of my sort of happiest memories. We spent some formative years as a teenager with a dairy farm, small family dairy farm, milking the cows in the morning, going to school, coming back and milking the cows in the afternoon. It was very enjoyable, a very nice lifestyle. For my sins, I ended up as a chartered accountant, as you said, and spent time in commerce and in business. But I've always had an interest in the land, and the thing that was always sitting in the back of my mind was why farming seemed to be so tough all the time. I know there's seasonal conditions, I know there's difficulties with that, but it seemed that the land was degrading for reasons other than just climatic conditions. And it just seems that something was we weren't doing something properly. There was something missing. And probably 10, 15 years ago, I came across a book by Alan Savory, Holistic Management, a new framework for decision making. And when I read that book, it was fascinating. It was really interesting because it pretty much provided a very balanced view of things, but it also answered ecologically everything that I'd seen happening on grazing lands in Australia. It explained to me, as I was reading the book, what was happening on the land, why it was happening. It also made it obvious that it didn't need to happen, and if we did things differently, we could fix it. And that was a fascinating part of it. So ecologically, it made a lot of sense. The social aspect of it made sense. And then financially, what jumped out of it, it was just a very good way to run a business. The decision-making processes, the disciplines that was provided in that way of thinking, wrapped together nicely and packaged it up. Now, I met a friend, Bruce Ward, who was a holistic management educator. Spent some time with Bruce, and what came out of it was went to a conference in Armidale in New South Wales. Alan Savory was the keynote speaker, and at the end of his keynote speech, he basically said, if you think this stuff's important, if you think it matters, if you think somebody should do something about it, that somebody is you, get up and do something. And I thought, okay, that's fine. So I started looking at how do we do it? Do we do it at, what were the pieces that were missing? And what became obvious to me was that what was missing was the scale. A lot of people were doing it very successfully with their farming their family farm and their small operation, and their not necessarily introspective and limited view, but a view that worked really well for them. It was addressing the issues that they had in their life on their family farm and their succession and their children, etc. But there was an opportunity to do it at scale, and if we could connect institutional level capital, basically add zeros to the process. So people who are doing 1,000 acres, if we could do 100,000 acres, people who are investing $1 million, if we could invest 100 million. There was an opportunity there to take it to sort of jump through and take it up a couple of orders of magnitude, and that's what we started working on. And the idea was to try to connect institutional capital with the opportunities on the land, and that's, we've had some degree of success with that.
Yeah, can you walk us through a bit of the overview of what you're currently working on and have been working on for the last few years in Australia, and how does that look like practically on the ground when you scale it up from working on your farm yourself with this approach to a number of properties and in a more fund-like structure?
So what we've got is basically, in order for it to work at scale, you obviously need to have, if you're going to deploy $100 million, at the moment the SLM's fund is about a $100 million fund. We've got about 1.4 million acres, so 480,000 hectares under management at the moment. There's about 700,000 acres, which is 280,000 hectares, is fully developed with new water systems, new fencing infrastructure, new cattle yards, 5 full-time managers and a crew of people, and cattle being operated and cattle there being moved, etc., etc. So the farms are fully functional and up and running. Okay, so where we start is we're looking at it and we're saying, okay, we want to deploy $100 million. The basic theory is that we buy, I suppose what you call the elements of easy. We're looking for country that's easy to manage, that's easy to operate, that's easy to put the infrastructure in, it's easy to get access to, that it gives us opportunities and choices in terms of where we can sell cattle to, where we can buy cattle from, how we can manipulate the animals to make sure we have the right animals in the right place at the right time for the reasons that make sense in the whole business package. So it's a way of thinking about that. To get the scale, it means that we need to be, you can't put together 100,000 acres, 40,000 hectares outside of a capital city. We have to be several hundred or 800 or 900 kilometres away from capital cities to get the scale of land we're looking about. So when we look at that country, what we've got is inherently good quality country that has been inappropriately managed. Now, I'm not saying it's been wrongly managed, it's been managed inappropriately. People have managed with best intentions in most cases. What they haven't had is the knowledge and the insight as to how the ecosystem functions, how grasses and grazing animals co-evolved, and what is meant to happen in nature, and what, if you don't do, really has some very negative effects on you. So a lot of this land has been degraded through inappropriate management as much as in bad seasonal conditions. A lot of this land, because people haven't had a lot of money, and also things like plastic pipes for distributing water You go back 50 years, you didn't have that sort of technology. You didn't have the infrastructure that, the way to put infrastructure in. You had horse and cart versus bulldozers. You couldn't do the same sorts of physical amount of work and physical amount of moving, put the infrastructure in. So there's reasons they didn't have things. We take those properties and we look at them and say, okay, here's a good water resource distributed inappropriately. We could do something with that. Here's some paddock sizes. They're a bit inappropriate. They're too big, too small, whatever they are. We then change things. So we take a chunk of country, 100,000 acres. We put a good water system in there. We put a different way of setting out the fencing. We get it set up so that we have control over our animals and control over when they're in paddocks, when they're resting in the paddock, when they come back into the paddock, all those sorts of factors. So that's basically what the process is. So the fundamental thesis of it is that we buy a chunk of land that's inherently good quality land. It's been degraded. It's operating below its inherent potential due to inappropriate management and a lack of appropriate infrastructure. We put the infrastructure in. We change the management to what we believe is appropriate management. And over the life of a fund, we basically double the long-term carrying capacity. We effectively run twice as many animals as you normally would, and we halve the cost of production. So if you're running twice as many animals at half the cost of production, you drop out a reasonable return to investors. And that's the really broad brush and simple view of what we're doing.
Yeah, that's an enormous difference. I can imagine on how the land looked before and how the land was performing before. You also worked as an advisor for farmers before. And did you notice, because of course 100 years ago or 50 or 60 years ago, this technology wasn't there, and this knowledge probably of how grass interacts with livestock wasn't there. But 10, 15 or 20 years ago, it started to emerge. Savory has been working on this for quite a bit. How is it that not all farmers or 70% of the farmers are using this? And is there something that holds them back against new technologies or new ways of looking at it?
Yeah, I personally wasn't advising farmers. Bruce was doing that consistently, and I had a lot of time in vehicles annoying Bruce, asking him a lot of questions. And one of the questions I consistently, exactly the one that you just asked, this stuff is so obvious, why doesn't everybody do it? You'll see, for example, some of the fence line photographs, and I've been at fence lines between somebody managing their country the way that we're talking about, and the neighbour not managing it, and we're doing it ourselves with SLM. We've got direct comparisons with the neighbours, and it's pretty obvious that there's a difference there.
It's striking, yeah.
The question then becomes, why don't they change? And one of the most consistent things that I've found with every farmer I've ever met is that they're all human beings, and human beings are not necessarily the most rational creatures on the planet. We work on emotions. We work on post-decision rationalisation, and we find reasons that things are different. And you've got to remember, in a lot of these cases, you've got a farming community. You've got people who've grown up with the people who are their third or fourth generation, their father and grandfather. The land is probably still in the grandfather's name. The father lives on the property. They're then trying to work the thing. They haven't sorted out succession issues yet. They don't really, they're working on the land, but they don't own the land. They want to change anything. They don't really have the right to make the decisions yet. There's a lot of frustration gets built up there. What they're doing is what their father and grandfather did. What they're doing is what all their friends and neighbours and everyone they know is managing the way they're managing. And while they might look over the fence to see one neighbour who's doing things a little bit differently and his property looks different, you've got to remember that they have other neighbours, and when they look at the other neighbours, their other neighbours look like they do. So what they're seeing most of the time is everything looking like what they're doing because everyone's doing what they're doing. For them to make a change, what they've got to do at some level is acknowledge that what they have been doing hasn't been working, and it's been, to use a term, wrong. Now, for anyone to acknowledge to themselves that what they've been doing is wrong is a fairly big step. But when what they've been doing is what their father and grandfather did, what their friends and neighbours and uncles and everyone they know is doing that, they're basically saying that everyone they know is doing it wrong. That's in a small community, in any sort of community, that's a big step to take. And as a result, most people who actually do this make the change out of desperation. It's almost the last throw of the dice. It's they're about to lose things. They find this and they have to do something different. Families have broken up over this. There's been big disputes over this. There's been a lot of stuff because it does call into question what we've been doing for the last 50 years. Okay, so that's where the social part of it becomes really tricky. And that's where, in my thinking, the opportunity was, from a fund point of view, we can come in and do something. I don't consider ourselves to be a corporate operation in the terms of corporate man or a corporate business. I think we're a very commercial business, but we don't want to bring that corporate, there's some negative aspects of the corporate culture, so I don't want to bring that across. I want to bring a very, very embarrassingly simple, to use a Bill Mollison term, an embarrassingly simple sort of structure to it and a discipline. We can come in as outsiders and we can do some things that somebody who's bolted into the community couldn't do. We can have our managers do things on our behalf that they couldn't do. Probably they would struggle to do if they were owning their own properties.
Yeah, because as an outsider, you can get away with it.
We can, as an outsider, we can do that. Now, and I think that's the big thing that people don't allow for in this, in terms of it. I've had people look at the presentation you give and photos, and they go, can't this guy see what's happening next door? Why doesn't he change? And it completely leaves out the incredible, the price we pay as human beings for being in a social structure. We have to get on with our friends and neighbours. We have to go to the pub after football on a Friday or after the kids' school function or the swimming carnival or whatever. We have to interact with these people all the time. We have to be very careful how far you push that and how far we expect other people to push when we wouldn't do it ourselves.
Yeah, because otherwise you'll be the crazy one and basically being pushed out of all the social life in the village or in the community in general.
Village is a very good term for it, because we are whatever the size of it is, even where you are in Florence or in Rome or in London, you're in the whole thing. But part of the breakdown is that if it's working in London, for example, your pub is your village. Now that's breaking down a bit, but that's where the village interaction was. So there was lots of little villages, and that's who we interact with.
Yeah, you don't want to be considered the weird one or the crazy one. A few people do, and they were probably the ones that were moving out of desperation or out of pure will to change things. Have you seen now that you're operating in some of these communities as an outsider that maybe others start to look differently at this approach because somebody else is validating it for them and they maybe can refer to that? Is there some spillover effect there?
I do think that's a very, very, very good point. I think, and you're right. We've probably, if I look at the transition we've had over the last 4 years, and we started this fund back in about 2012, we actually acquired our first properties and took control at the start of 2013. So we're sort of 3 to 4 years in communities. That transition has been interesting. The first year or two, it was like SLM, sustainable land management. Well, SLM was stupid land management and silly land management. It was all these sorts of little things. And there'd be a few niggly little sort of comments made in passing, etc. And, this isn't going to work. It's not going to work here. And what we found out really, really quickly, it's amazing the number of people who have absolutely no idea what it is that we're doing, actually. They don't understand what the grazing process is and what the logic and the science behind it. They know nothing about that, but they know one clear fact, that it won't work here. They were adamant it wouldn't work for reasons they weren't sure, but they just knew it wouldn't. And that was the social part of it.
Because here it's different.
Yeah, it's different here. Okay, it's too wet, it's too dry, too hot, too cold, too this, too that. This stuff works anywhere grass grows, which gives you a fairly big chunk of the planet that it works on. So it works differently but the same, because you're still interacting with animals and grazing, the whole package. Interestingly, over the period of time, we've probably had the transition starting to happen where we've got neighbours interested in what we're doing, we've got neighbours asking questions about it. One of the neighbours flew over our country probably 8 months ago when things were really dry, and he said that and he knows when he flew over SLM country because it wasn't shiny. Everything else he was flying over was shiny. We had ground cover. We had something, even in the middle of the drought, we had enough that it was visible from the air, that our country wasn't shining off as much as the other neighbours were. He's been positive about it. They actually had some of their cattle running on our country because they'd run short of feed. We had some feed. He was very impressed with how the cattle came back. They were much quieter after being managed the way we managed. We used low stress stock handling. The cattle were mothering up better with their calves. The condition they put on while they're on the property. He's always been supportive or open to the ideas, but he was just blown away with watching his own animals and seeing the difference it could make to them. We're getting good reports from sale yards where the cattle come through one of the major sale yards in Queensland. They were the quietest cattle they've had through there in the whole year, and they're putting through 5,000 or 10,000 animals a week. So those sorts of things, you start to build a reputation. You're in the community. We've been to the local country race meeting 3 years in a row, and when we're not two-headed and we're not chanting some sort of mantra, and we're obviously not part of some bizarre cult. We're just running cows, and we're doing it a little bit differently to what other people are doing, and it seems to be, it might be working. So I think those sorts of things, it'll be a slow, steady process, but people mightn't do quite as intensively as we are, but they'll start to change a little bit, and it gives them permission, I think, is an important part.
And when you look at the last year, so if you look a year back, so basically it's November 2015 till now, what has been the biggest change and shift you've seen in the operations and in the company?
Okay, well, the biggest shift was that in November 2015, we were probably in the third year of a very severe drought. So the first 3 years in terms of character building, we had 3 of the 4 driest years in the last 120 were the first 3 years of operating the farm. So we ran straight into the teeth of a blazing drought.
Talking about timing.
Yeah, it was interesting. It made us better people. We're all better people. The country that we've got is on the bottom of the Warrego River, which is a river system in Queensland, and it's what they call the salad. It's known as the salad bowl because if there's rain in some ranges 300 or 600 kilometres north of us, that can run down through the river system, and then we get a big, very gentle and beneficial flood across our country. The Warrego River, the first 3 years it didn't run, and that was the longest period in records that there was no water flowing down the river. So not only didn't we get rainfall, we also didn't get this beneficial flooding. So we lost both things, and that was pretty much unheard of in recorded European settlement of Australia. Obviously, it would have happened in the previous 40, 50,000 years, but in the last 150, it hadn't happened. So we got to a point where we had completely destocked the properties, which is almost unheard of. So we had 700,000 acres with 30 cattle on it. Now, that was a fairly dramatic move, but it was without doubt the best thing we did because it allowed us time to, rather than having staff out there drought feeding and trying to push animals, etc., which is what most people would do, what the conventional approach is, we completely destocked, sold all the animals off. That gave the team time to recover and sort out some internal issues there. That gave the land time to recover, and it gave it the opportunity to not be shiny, to use the neighbour's term. So we had some biological activity. We had some life in the soil. Now, we then in June got the first lot of rain, the decent rain that we'd had for probably 18 months to 2 years. In September, we got another backup lot of rain. So those 2 amounts of rain were the first time in the 4 years that in a 12-month period, we'd had our average rainfall. Over the 4-year period, we're still a year and a half short of rain, but it was the first time. So we're still in a deep hole to fill up the soil moisture profile and to regenerate the ecosystem. That's just part of the environment in which we operate. Averages are a long-term thing. You're below average a long period of time, and you'll have a couple of good years. So we also then got some flooding through, and we probably got between 40 and 50,000 acres, 20,000 hectares that got beneficial flooding. So that's just an incredible difference. And to see the diversity, to see the speed with which the country responded to that beneficial flooding and how much how the water, just the myriad places the water distributed itself into. Just nature in action was absolutely amazing to watch. And we've started restocking. So where we are now, from zero cattle, we're at about 3,000 animals again. We'll be building up to about 10 to 12,000 head on the properties in the next 3 months. We've got animals that are being moved in a very consistent, low-stress way, that they're performing well, they're gaining well, they're leaving country in a better condition as they graze it than it was before they went into it. So yeah, just the energy in the business is good. It was a hiatus between that really dry period and a good bit of rain, and it's you can see the benefit of what we did. You can see the benefit of even those first couple of tough years, not having pushed the country too hard. Just those little aspects are starting to tie together, and this is I'm still confident that over the 10 years life of the fund, we'll achieve what we set out to achieve, and it'll be a slow start, and there'll be one or two good jumps.
And when you look at the land of the neighbors, how did that respond differently to the events of the last year? So basically June and September. Are there big differences, and what are they?
I think that the differences are that our land probably responded more rapidly, and it probably held on a little bit longer. So the principle is that so in a sort of situation we've got, for your listeners, that the idea in a seasonally dry or intermittent rainfall area, what you'll have is, let's say it's a drought and things are really tough and things are dry, and you've got a small number of sheep, for example. It might have 200 sheep in a 3,000 acre paddock, a pasture. So there's not very many animals in there, and it's got a lot of country. And these sheep are just spending their time, and every day they're looking for the best thing they can find to eat. That's the only thing they want to do, is find the best thing they can eat. Now, if it's been dry for 7 or 8 months, obviously there's not too many best things left. They're picking at the basics. They're eking out an existence, and they're just surviving. Now, a rain event comes through. Okay, so we get 3 good days of rain, and the soil's nice and moist, and little plants start to poke their heads up. Well, when those little tiny plants poke their heads up, they're soft and they're tender and they're very vulnerable, and the sheep will go through and they will have a great time picking those out. But having picked those little plants out, those little plants, have used up their energy in the seed to try to get out of the ground. They get their head nipped off. Okay, the sheep go off and nip something else, and they'll come back 3 or 4 days later because that little plant tries to grow again, and it's just grown some beautiful, soft, luscious, it's only a small mouthful, but it's a nice little mouthful. And the sheep will come back and take it out again. And what you end up with is the animals selectively grazing out of the ecosystem any palatable, productive and nutritious plants. They selectively pick the best of them, and they graze them pretty much out of the ecosystem. And what they're left with then is the thorny, spiky, toxic, nasty plants, because they're the ones they don't like to eat. So you start to end up, every time you get a bit of a seasonal break, the country almost goes back a bit rather than going forward. And you can see that in the long-term records, where about every generation there's a 20 to 50% drop in carrying capacity. The next generation there's another drop. With our process, what we do is we go in, and when instead of those couple of hundred sheep being in 3,000 acres, we'll have 2,000 cattle in 500 acres, but they'll only be there for a day or two, and then they'll move to the next one. So we have a lot more animals in a smaller area for a shorter period of time. The important thing is, while they're in that pasture, they're not anywhere else. So if they're in pasture number 1, then out of, say, 50 pastures, and they're there for 2 days, it'll take 100 days before they come back. Now, during that 100 days, that little palatable plant that stuck its head up gets a chance to grow up a bit. It gets a chance to put down roots. It gets a chance to establish itself, to build up some body and some capacity to handle when it does get grazed. And then when it starts to regrow, the animals are out of the paddock. So you totally change the way that you respond to a good seasonal event, a good rainfall event. And that's probably the noticeable part of it, that on our country, you can see we have more in terms of quantity and more in terms of variety of plants than the direct neighbours on a consistent basis. And that's our first good rain event. So, this will build, and the next time we'll then build again, because while the plants are green above ground, there's a lot of things happening below ground. And that's the important part, is what's happening below ground, because that builds your resilience, that improves your capacity for water to infiltrate, that changes the soil structure, that builds microbes and bacteria and fungi, and all the things to build a really healthy village around every grass plant. And that's the sort of stuff we're looking at.
Extremely, extremely interesting. So you're obviously hoping for a few good years to come in terms of rain. When you look at the operations 1 year from now, what do you think would be different when you're basically in year 4/5 of the operation? What would be the main difference if we look back a year from now?
I think the big thing will be, this will be our first year of actually just operations without any infrastructure development. So we've got all our fencing and all our infrastructure done. We've moved from a development phase into a straight operational phase. It's a little hard to say. It does depend on the seasonal conditions. So for the fund to work over the 10 years, we need probably 3 average years. It's just that in the country that we're in, it might take a decade to get 3 average years. If we get 2 or 3 good years, it'll really kick things. If you can put 2 years behind, 2 years in a row, you really get a change. I think the big thing will happen is that, and the thing that I'm really looking forward to is the 40 or 50,000 acres or 20,000 hectares of this beneficial flooding country. And I'll send you a couple of photos of it. It's amazing to see how this country, for example, probably in imperial measurements, for every mile it drops about a foot in elevation. It's almost tabletop flat. So when you do get a flood, it just dissipates in amazing directions. Little fingers of water roll out everywhere. Now, what has happened for the last 150 years is animals have always been in there. So when it started to flood, the animals pushed out from the edge, out from that country, and they've gone into the sort of the higher country, which might only be a half a metre or a metre out of the water. And then as the flood waters recede, they've worked their way through and they've picked at all the plants on the way in, okay, until they've got in the middle. And so you ended up with some plants being chewed out and some plants being long and rank. This will be the first time in a lot of this country that it's been our style of management where we've put a big number of animals into an area, we've had that impact, and then we've given it time to recover. So the fascinating bit to see will be, if we get a graze out of this pasture now and we haven't had rain, but we've got good subsoil moisture, do we get a good recovery in the grasslands? Can we come back and get a second graze out of the flood that we had 6 months ago? It'd be fascinating if in 12 months' time we're having a conversation and I'm saying to you that we've got cattle grazing still through some of this flood country on the benefit of a flood that happened 12 months earlier. That would be absolutely amazing, because it means we've changed the ecosystem in a very positive way. That'd be the highlight. That's what I'll be looking forward to next.
We're going to check definitely in 12 months if that happens. And
I'll let you.
What's on your mind for the next few months? What's the main thing that while you're switching from this really building up the infrastructure to more an operational phase of the fund, what's the main thing that keeps you awake at night?
Probably the main thing that keeps me awake at night is the opportunities. I'm not being kept awake at night worrying about seasonal conditions and it being tough, etc. That's I did enough of that probably 3 years ago, 2 years ago. The exciting part of it is looking at the opportunities. Where I'd like to be over the next 3 to 6 months is from the business point of view, the business running well. Got a couple of new managers in there. We've just had the whole crew have gone through a low stress stock handling course, and they've all had some really interesting insights in that. The stress on animals is the biggest hidden cost in any agriculture involving animals. That's the antibiotics and all those things that come into it. So even if you take out the confinement operations and the stress that's in that, handling livestock, handling any living creature, there's stress can come into it, and we can do a huge number of things to either put stress onto animals or take stress off. If we take the stress off the animals, not no stress at all, but appropriate stress when needed, and release that stress is the important part. They can handle a lot of stress as long as they know it releases. We can have some really tough days at work so long as we can have the weekend off. But we can't handle a constant, steady drip, drip, drip of either tedium or too much stress. Now, that part of it, the difference in animal performance, the difference in weight gain, the difference in pregnancy rate, the difference in weaning rates that come from removing stress off animals is phenomenal. And that's an exciting thing to see that happen, and see the whole team start to understand that and how they can connect to the animals, and how responsive animals are to us, and how we need to be very responsive to them. So if over the next 3 to 6 months I see that happening, I see the whole crew coming together on that really tightly. We get to a stage where we're getting feedback from people who are buying our cattle, glowing endorsements of the calmness of the animals, the way they performed so well for them, how they were, but if they've gone into a breeding operation, they were some of the best breeders they've ever had. The cattle handled really smoothly. Those sorts of factors. We're doing some more monitoring on the biological side of things. An external consultant comes in and does that. She'll be out again towards the end of the month, and she'll assess the whole property and see what we've done over that period of time. So we get some solid reports on that. We've had participation in the Australian government's carbon emissions reduction fund. So from a biological point of view, we're growing carbon, we're storing carbon, we're being rewarded for that. So if we go forward 3 to 6 months, we've got a business that from an investor point of view and from an investable point of view is maybe a little bit behind in terms of the bottom line because of the seasonal conditions, but has ticked a lot of other boxes. And we'll be in a position to go back to a lot of people and say, look, this is the story, this is what's happened, this is what you're seeing on the ground, and look to raise another lot of capital and to go into the market and start to put some more country back on the path to positive regeneration and general recovery.
So it's going to be an important and very interesting 3 to 6 months. When you look at regenerative agriculture from an investment point of view, you already referred to that a couple of times. For impact investors or for investors in general, what do you think are the two biggest barriers to scale up the regenerative agriculture mode? You've talked to many investors. What do you see as one of the biggest barriers to scale up this sector?
I think, to me, one of the things that people need to understand is it's not spreadsheet agriculture. You're dealing with biological systems. So in our particular area, not the cropping and not the tree crops, the silviculture, just the from a grazing point of view, the ecosystem that we're dealing with has got some swings and roundabouts. It is a program that takes time. So they need to be understanding that. They need to understand the biology part of it. I think Bill Mollison, the guy who started permaculture, is saying, while the problems of our planet are increasingly complex, the solutions remain embarrassingly simple. So there are some simple things that we can do differently to get a good result, but we're dealing with a complex process. So if you're in agriculture, you're dealing with living creatures. You're dealing with whether it's a chicken farm or it's a row crop or it's a prawn farm in Thailand or it's cattle farming in Australia. You are dealing with biology and living organisms. And it's not a chemical process or a physical process that does that. It's dealing with you don't need to be a tree-hugging, greeny, left-leaning liberal to appreciate the fact that your investment is built, its very foundation is biology. Okay? And if you've got to get that right, I mean, I'm talking with one group, their main metric they look at is soil carbon. If they're building carbon, that's their asset. Now, if they look at that, they've got that headspace sitting underneath it. That's a metric that works for them. As they build the carbon level in the soils and carbon in all their products, everything they sell is carbon-based. All the food products and all the wool and the meat and the vegetables, they're all carbon-based products. So rather than exporting that, if you can actually retain some, you're getting an asset that's actually building underneath you, and that's building long-term resilience. So I think that's one big part of it, is that a lot of big institutions, they can't assess regenerative agriculture because they don't understand what it is. They haven't got a group internally. They haven't got an allocation for agriculture, let alone regenerative agriculture. They are dealing with people who are, they might be a brilliant analyst and they're great with a spreadsheet, but they haven't got that bigger picture of what they're really talking about and where regenerative agriculture fits into a portfolio. What are the benefits? What are the basic, the de-risking benefits and the reduction in volatility and the lack of connection? It's not connected to the movements in fossil fuel prices. So there's a range of factors that come into play, and it's probably talking to somebody who is ecologically aware as well as being financially aware and can understand both sides of it. Whether or not that person has made their way far enough up the corporate food chain in these big institutions to make a decision. Something like the Global Impact Investor Network, an impact investor who's dealing with their own private wealth, they can make a decision around that. They can see how that fits in their portfolio. They can actually drive that a bit more. I think that's an opportunity, and it's a little bit like you were saying. Does SLM coming into a local area give permission for the other farmers to start to change what they're doing? Yes, I think it does. In the institutional space, in the investment space, do some members of GIIN, that group, to them making some investments in regenerative agriculture, give permission to the bigger institutions to start looking at that space a little bit more? And I think possibly that's the direction it needs to move. That's the way to shift it.
No, definitely. I mean, if one joins, then it gives sort of permission for others at least to look at it seriously. Did you notice a big shift when you got the Danish pension fund on board with that?
The number of people who, but I just find it interesting that in a lot of movies and a lot of things, like Wall Street and the Wolf of Wall Street and all this, people have this vision or this idea that people in these investment funds are dynamic, risk-taking, out there trying things. They're really on the edge. It's all the stress of down on the trading floor, etc. When you actually talk to them, they're incredibly risk-averse, and they want to follow they want to be with the mob. They want to be doing what everyone else is doing. To find somebody who actually go into somewhere different is incredibly rare. And the reason for that is a lot of times they go into somewhere incredibly different and it doesn't work. And you can't do that too many times in a row and keep a job in a big institutional pension fund. It doesn't work. So you need to be as safe as possible. And I understand that and I respect that because they're dealing with other people's money. But in terms of having a conversation with somebody, that's a great idea. Who else is investing? We had a number of people who said, we'll put some money in if you can find another two people to come in with it. Okay, and so then you're always constantly chasing to get, sort of, this will work if somebody else goes and somebody else goes. And then by the time you actually get somebody else lined up, they want something slightly different to the first group, so that doesn't quite align. So then you've got to try somebody else. I probably found there wouldn't have been 3 or 4 people really had the authority, had been given delegated authority to actually go and invest in something different. So it'll take a while to get that through.
Yeah, definitely. And if you, I mean, it's animal. We're all animals as well. It's like livestock. If you're spending too much time outside the herd, you probably get eaten.
Exactly.
And you won't do it a second time because you can't. Yeah, no, I understand. It takes incredible courage to defend something different in a corporate structure, in a big structure, and to make the case, especially also if the payback or the proof that you were right comes late and comes later, and over a 10-year fund, 10 years is pretty long, and people won't be there anymore. So it's
exactly.
It's not, look, I was right, and tomorrow we can see that I was actually right, sort of thing.
That's right. Yeah, and that's the tricky part of it. And that's where you're going to say, why aren't they investing? And we have this thing in Australia where some of the politicians every now and then will sort of bash their fist on the thing and say, okay, why aren't Australian superannuation funds investing in agriculture? And you go, well, the Australian press is always negative about agriculture, and it's always a problem, and there's always a drought, and there's always this, and they've also been, a lot of people have spent a lot of time educating Australians on the fact that we are a very small part of the global market, therefore you should diversify your portfolio, therefore you want a super fund that's invested in international shares and international property. Okay, well, you can't tell a story to people about you need to invest internationally and then get upset that they're not investing locally. You got to allow for that. So that there are some reasons that these things don't work, and it's not where they're investing at the moment. So,
and if you just to finish off, because I also want to be cautious of time, if you have one or two pieces of advice to smart investors that want to start investing, maybe their own money or maybe their institution's money into regenerative agriculture, what would be your main one or two pieces of advice?
Get really clear as to why they're looking at agriculture. What role does agriculture play in their portfolio? They want to invest in agriculture for diversification. They want to invest in agriculture because it's real asset backed and therefore some sort of protection against inflation. What is it that they're investing in it for? And is that investment thesis and that reason solid and stable enough for a decade or more? Is it something that the board and the investment committee have locked into and will give you a commitment to for a decade or longer? They need to have that. They need to know that they're coming into it for this reason. They have that very clearly enunciated and set out, and to get a commitment that reason is solid for the period of time it will take to do regenerative agriculture. The reason for that is that regenerative agriculture versus conventional agriculture, compare and contrast. Somebody goes into an undeveloped part of the Brazilian Cerrados, puts a big John Deere tractor with a great big plough on the back and ploughs all this country up, pours a whole amount of fertilizer into it. You can make the country grow something. Okay, you can force something out of it fairly quickly. You can set up a feedlot. You can put dairy cows into confinement. You can make them as a manufacturing process produce milk. Okay. To me, my way of thinking, that's an extractive process. You're extracting from the system. And over the course of a decade, the thing you've invested in is less resilient and less sustainable than it was when you started. Okay, so you've made a financial return, you've sucked it out of the thing, but what have you got left at the end of it? With regenerative agriculture, what we're doing is we are regenerating something. Inherent in that is we're starting with something that's below where it could be, and that takes time to be built up. We're dealing with a biological process. If we want to disconnect it from the index and have it not be correlated with the rest of the market, then if we disconnect from fossil fuel inputs, which drives a lot of things, we disconnect from a lot of external inputs, we're dealing with something that's provided free of charge, which is sunlight and rainfall. We get the biology working, we get the system more resilient, we start to build up something so that over the course of a decade, we have a stronger asset at the end than where we started. Okay, so that whole process of regenerating, of building something, taking something that is less than it could be and wants to be, and allowing it and developing it to build up to its full potential, that takes a certain amount of time. You need to have an investment horizon and a mindset that balances that. If the investment horizon and mindset doesn't build over that period of time the same way the underlying asset of the biology and the land that you're dealing with, that it also builds, then the two aren't going to tie together.
I think that's great advice and a really nice way to end this interview. I want to thank you for your time, Tony, and we'll definitely be checking in on the progress months and also years.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your interest.
Just listened to an interview with Tony Lovell, co-founder and CEO of SLM Partners. I hope you join us again soon with more interviews with key players in the regenerative agriculture space.
If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, if this podcast has been of value to you and if you have the means, please join my Patreon community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on patreon.com/regenerativeagriculture or in the description below. Thank you so much and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food.
how to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? What questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space. For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, agtech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're gonna look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soil builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.